All right, good morning, everyone, and welcome to FWMD Live. Today, we are discussing how we can avoid spreading incorrect information about Jewish Americans and also how that can affect patient care. And we have a group of panelists with us today, so it's going to be a great discussion. But before we get to that, we're going to start with me. I'm Prescotte Stokes III, the Integrated Content and Marketing Manager at the TCU School of Medicine. And joining us for our discussion is Lisa McBride, the Associate Dean of Diversity and Inclusion here at the School of Medicine. Good morning, Dr. McBride.
Good morning, and thank you, Prescott, for hosting such an important topic for our TCU community and for medical schools from Fort Worth to Philadelphia. Thank you for having me.
All right, thank you, Dr. McBride. All right, so we are also happy to have Vlad Khaykin, the National Director of Programs on Anti-Semitism for the Anti-Defamation League, joining us today. How you doing, Vlad? All right, so we have Vlad, and then we also, all the way from downtown Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, we have Dr. Pat Lannutti, the Vice Chairman of the Department of Internal Medicine at the Philadelphia College of Osteopathic Medicine. How are you doing, Dr. Lannutti?
Good. Good afternoon. It's actually afternoon in this wonderful part of the world. Thank you for having me.
All right, yeah, we got that hour time difference between the East Coast and us down here in North Texas. All right, and we also have Benjamin Jacobs. He's a second-year medical student, and he is also a member of the Jewish Student Interest Group here at the School of Medicine. How you doing, Ben?
Hi, Prescott. It's nice to join you all.
All right, so if you want to be a part of this conversation, it's really simple. All you need to do is jump into the comments, leave your questions for our guests, and then we will get you some answers. But before we get to your questions, we are going to begin this discussion with Vlad. So we recently had an attack on a Jewish synagogue in Colleyville in January. In Colleyville, for everyone that's watching, that is right outside of Fort Worth here in Tarrant County. Now, a rabbi and 3 members of his congregation were taken hostage by an allegedly armed man, but thankfully they were eventually rescued. The FBI has publicly said that the attack is being treated like an act of terrorism targeting the Jewish community by terrorists exposing an anti-Semitic worldview. So Vlad, what I want you to do to start this discussion is explain to our viewers what anti-Semitism is. All right, and so we have Vlad. And what I want to do right now, what we're going to do is once we get Vlad going, we have a link that Vlad has shared that he is going to put into the comment section in the chat. And Dr. McBride, I'm just going to start with you because part of the reason that we're having this conversation today is because our Jewish Student Interest Group came to your department after that attack in Colleyville and decided that they wanted to have a larger discussion about this situation. So what was the message from the medical students to your team?
The message was a simple one, and that is that, after numerous events of anti-Semitism around our country and our city, friendly city of Dallas-Fort Worth, what they wanted is that the TCU School of Medicine needed to take a stand against these recent spikes of anti-Semitic bias incidents. And so they desired that there be education, and not only for our medical students, but for other members of the TCU community at large and for our Fort Worth neighbors. And so it was clear to me that these bias incidents represented the accumulation of a lifetime of anti-Semitic experiences for our students. And so I told my team in the Office of Diversity that we needed to be proactive. And that's when I called Stacy Cushion at the Anti-Defamation League locally, the region that covers North Texas and all of Oklahoma. And I said, hey, Stacy, let's share in this programming. And thus we have our remarkable panel today. But also one of the things that I recognized is that I needed to bring an astute person to the conversation. And so I called my dear friend, Dr. Pat Lannutti, internal medicine doctor at PCOM. And we teamed up again, Dr. Lannutti, so thank you.
All right. And so Dr. McBride also has some information that we're going to put into the comments section. There was a study on anti-Semitism in education that the University of California in Berkeley actually does in their Jewish Studies department. So we're going to put that link in the comment section so you can get more information. And Ben, I just want to come to you since your student interest group at the School of Medicine talked to Dr. McBride's team. You all actually put out a letter and sent it to all of the medical students here at the TCU School of Medicine. So tell me why that was important to do for your student interest group.
Sure, absolutely. Thank you for that question, Prescott. It's important to have this Jewish student interest group because it's important to let applicants and current students of the community know that there's a community of Jewish students here. And if you're applying to the medical school, just because the name of the medical school is Texas Christian University, that doesn't mean that Jewish students aren't wanted here, or that doesn't mean that there's not a community here for Jewish students. And on like a greater scheme, the Jewish student interest group really is to educate students. Jewish people, like African Americans, like LGBTQ community, are minority groups. And unfortunately, they're subject to hate and violence every day. And so it's imperative that we can educate each other on these things, as well as kind of the history about it. But really at its core, the whole idea of the group is to really create allies. And it's about to celebrate Jewish traditions, to celebrate holidays, and to educate those about the history of the Jewish people and about the Holocaust and anti-Semitism, so history really doesn't repeat itself.
All right, thank you for that, Ben. That's very good information. And it's really nice to see the medical students taking that kind of initiative outside of their studies. So this is FWMD Live for anyone watching. Today we are talking about misinformation, anti-Semitism, and hate, and how we can kind of correct those issues within our communities across America. We have Vlad Khaykin from the ADL, the Anti-Defamation League, joining us as well. And so Vlad, I want to come back to you and just talk about the attacks in Colleyville in January. The person that actually allegedly committed these attacks, the FBI actually classified him as a terrorist exposing an anti-Semitic worldview. So can you explain to our viewers what anti-Semitism is by definition?
Yeah, sorry about the technical difficulties. So, anti-Semitism is many things, right? Some will describe it simply as Jew hatred, but that doesn't really tell the whole story, right? Because hatred is a feeling. Anti-Semitism is a systemic form of oppression. That is, it operates independent of human sentiment or affect. Some regard anti-Semitism as a kind of religious bigotry, right? But that also doesn't tell the whole story, because while anti-Semitism can target Jewish people on the basis of their theological beliefs or how they practice their religion, I would say more often than not, anti-Semitism today isn't based in a sort of a theological bigotry. Rather, it's a racialized form of bigotry that constructs the Jew as not merely a religious other, but as a racial other. Anti-Semitism can, be described as a form of marginalization or oppression of Jewish people or people who are perceived to be Jewish, based on certain stereotypes, myths, and disinformation about Jewish people, culture, history, Judaism, Zionism, or the Jewish state of Israel. But I would say perhaps the most important thing to understand about anti-Semitism is that it often functions as a kind of grand conspiracy theory that sees a Jewish hand behind major social, political, economic, and other problems in the world. So anti-Semitism functions as a kind of misdiagnosis of the way the world functions.
And Vlad, can you also just talk about, now this actually happened at a synagogue in Colleyville. So how does this misinformation about the Jewish community put places of worship in danger all across America?
Yeah, absolutely. Conspiracy theories aren't just something that, is passed around the internet and is kind of entertaining and fun to laugh at. They really are quite dangerous. We can look at, for example, the deadliest act of anti-Semitic mass violence in US history, which happened just a couple of years ago at the Pittsburgh Tree of Life Synagogue, right? The killer in that attack was motivated by a anti-Semitic conspiracy theory known as the Great Replacement Theory, that basically blamed Jews for allegedly flooding the country with people who, quote unquote, don't belong here, right? It was the same conspiracy theory that motivated the killer in the Poway shooting. But the thing about anti-Semitism to understand is it's not just a problem for the Jewish community, because it was that same anti-Semitic conspiracy theory that motivated the killer in the Christchurch attack, where 49 Muslims were murdered at a mosque, right, in Christchurch. It was the same conspiracy theory that also motivated the killer in El Paso, Texas, not too far from you all, where Latino immigrants were targeted, right? So anti-Semitism really is more than just something that harms the Jewish community. It is a broadly corrosive and toxic social element that has repercussions for many of our marginalized communities.
All right. Thank you for that information, Vlad. And we also have another link that we're going to share in the comments that kind of goes hand in hand with what Vlad just described about misinformation toward the Jewish community in America. I want to let everybody watching know this is FWMD Live. Today we are talking about misinformation, anti-Semitism, and hate. We have a great group of panelists. If you have any questions, just put them in the comment section, and then I'll get you some answers from our guests. So now I kind of want to take this conversation and move it into medicine and patient care. So Dr. Lannutti, at the Philadelphia College of Osteopathic Medicine, there is an art contest to help medical students understand how social issues can affect the practice of medicine. Can you just tell us why is that important, and how does it speak to the spirit aspect of osteopathic medicine? I'm sorry, I butchered.
Had a hard time getting that out, didn't you?
Yes.
Be careful you don't get a pink slip on that one.
Don't hold it against me. But can you explain to us
why? Well, you know, the big word that I'm sure Ben's used to is stress. Stress is just all over the place. The pandemic did not help alleviate it. I've been chair of the admissions committee at PCOM for the last 5 years. And when we ask them, what is their understanding of the osteopathic philosophy, they say, holistic body, mind, spirit, which makes me wince because, Ben, we're on, you know, it's not like you're in a room and people can't see your expression. So I may say, what do you mean by spirit? The spirit of 76, the spirit of your university. And I think when they had developed these contests, and you can Google PCOM art contests, you can see the alleviation of stress. Some of them are peaceful seascapes. Some of them are in the woods. Some of them are rather tortured pictures of anatomy, which I guess reflects CMBM and SPOM and the way they're thinking. When I started school, we had a course called The History of Medicine, and there was a lot of art involved in it. We live in a very culturally refined city. The Philadelphia Museum of Art, we have an orchestra, we have a wonderful, the Barnes Foundation. Unfortunately, what we've done was we've constricted our curriculum to allow the students to be able to be board passers. And when you create board passers, you create students who look at the patient as bed 213 by the window, the 80-year-old with the patient who has blood pressure, the non-adherent patient, you know, not the humanity of it. So when you expand to the art, whether it be the tortured paintings of Picasso, Guernica, the Charnel House, or the Symphony No. 13 by Shostakovich, which was a commemoration of the 300,000 Jews that were killed outside of Kiev, which was a play on the poem Babi Yar. The magnificent John Williams solo violin piece in Schindler's List, the movie, the Voyage of the Damned. You get a big picture. you can expand your horizons. It's like wide screen. To me, that all encompasses spirit, which is depth and future and freedom and beauty and truth.
And Dr. Lannutti, actually, I want to bring Benjamin back into this conversation because here at the TCU School of Medicine, we have the compassionate practice curriculum that uses journalism techniques to help students with patient care and taking patients' history. And then also there's theater techniques to help students understand these types of conversations that they may walk into as physicians. So Ben, how has that curriculum so far during your first 2 years of medical school here helped you with your patient encounters within the community?
Sure, yeah, that's a great question. And it certainly has helped. You know, a lot of the times when you go to perhaps other medical schools or when I was interviewing, they talked a lot about SP encounters and you get the experience like from the point of view of the physician interviewing the patient. But when I interviewed here, it was really different. They talked about that, but they also talked about, hey, sometimes you're going to be the patient, or sometimes you're going to be the insurance company. And when we have classes, we're actually trying to put ourselves in the shoes of the patient or the shoes of the nurse that overheard something or the shoes of somebody else. And so I think that has definitely helped in my interactions now. And when I'm in the clinic now, I always try to tell myself, like, what is the patient really thinking? Like, put myself in their shoes. You know, I think it's tough to wake up at 5 a.m. to go round, but what about them? You know, they're in the hospital and then I have to go knock on their door in their room at 5:30 to, you know, talk to them, and they might not have gotten good sleep. So the curriculum really has taught me to put myself in their shoes and to consider all other options. It's not just one factor. They're a person too. So really kind of when I enter that room, that space, to kind of acknowledge that they're a different person and try to put myself in their shoes.
And Dr. McBride, I actually want you to jump in on this a little bit because Dr. Lannutti brought up a very good point about stress. And then with the pandemic kind of ongoing, how that has changed the stress level, especially in medical students. When the medical students come to your office, when they have to talk about things that are outside of the medical school curriculum, what kind of support do you all offer and have for those medical students outside of some of the other things that we have within our curriculum?
Some of the things we try to do in the Office of Diversity is to support the curriculum and have co-curricular activities like today's event, and also to have brave space conversations where our students can lean in to the discomfort about topics like we're talking about today. I think it's important for us to remember that unless we really are willing to have the conversation, then how are we going to overcome some of the challenges of this nation? And so as we talk later in this session, I'm going to talk about in an educational setting, how can you really deal and address hate? And so I'm looking forward to that question from you.
And Dr. Lannutti, can you also share with us what advice throughout your medical education career, what advice have you shared with Jewish medical students about identifying with their culture in medical work environments?
Well, up until a few weeks ago, I would say I'm in a very fortunate part of the world. We are the poorest large city in the United States, highly diverse. When I was in medical school, we had the Log fraternity, which is Jewish fraternity. We have Phi Sig, which was the Catholic fraternity. And all we ever did was had parties together. And but only recently, Sam Finkelstein, who is actually one of our medical residents and a student, and I were in the room at Abington, and the patient said, I want doctor to leave the room. I don't want a Jewish doctor near me. So I don't necessarily have an unexpressive face, but as Maimonides said, God help me to look at this patient as a creature in pain. So we talked outside and I said, you know, folks, consider the source. The patient's in pain, the patient's suffering. They may not be reasoning. Lisa said something good about dialogue. I went to 8 years of Jesuit school, and I always think Jesuitical and rabbinical, I don't know if that would get a good mark, but it's the dialogue and then the interaction and the discussion and the why not, which We'd be nice if it went on in the world today if you read the news. So when we dialogued about it, I said, Sam, you come from a magnificent culture. You know, since Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, you were persecuted because you stuck to your principles all through history until you got to through the Roman Empire and the Middle Ages and who caused the plague and all that stuff up until 1873, which was the protocols of the I forget the name of that stuff, of Zion, which said that 15 rabbis were going to take over the world. I may be imprecise, Vlad, but you know where I'm saying. Until the Holocaust, basically pigeonholing people. I said, you know, it's jealousy, because what I ever see in the Jewish people, race, religion, is dialogue, discussion, willing to include and not be always willing to exclude. So I said, and I'll say this again, stay calm and carry on.
Stay calm and carry on. That's wise words. I just want to let everybody know that this is FWMD Live. Today, we are having a very important discussion about misinformation, anti-Semitism, and hate. If you have any questions for our panel of experts, you can just jump into the comments and leave your question, and then I will definitely get you some answers. I want to talk about the American Jewish Committee's annual State of Anti-Semitism in America report that was released in October 2021. Now, included, this was one of the largest ever surveys of American Jews and the US general public on anti-Semitism in America. And this report showed deep anxiety among American Jews and divergent views among the general public about the severity of anti-Semitism in the United States. We will actually put a link to that report in the comments right now. But I thought an interesting point of view from the general public version of that survey was a question was asked, is anti-Semitism taken more seriously, less seriously, or is it considered to be the same as other forms of hate and bigotry? Now, 15% of Americans surveyed considered it to be more serious, 47% considered it to be the same, but 38% of Americans surveyed thought that it was less serious than other forms of hate and bigotry. So Vlad, can you just tell us why, when you look at numbers like that, why that's important to understand and how we can combat this misinformation about the Jewish population and that anti-Semitism is a form of hate?
Yeah, well, I'll say a couple things. You know, one of the other things that the AJC found was that half of Americans either have never heard the word anti-Semitism or don't know what it means, right? So this is a phenomenon that is very poorly understood. You know, I would say that, you know, it begins with your own education, right? We're really just scratching the surface here today. So the first thing I would say is continue your own education about this topic, not only about anti-Semitism, but about Jewish people, who we are, right? Because so much of anti-Semitism in our society is based on bigotry or misunderstanding about who Jews are, what Judaism is, and so on. Secondly, I would say it's important that you also identify opportunities to educate others, right? Make sure that you, you know, take in the education yourself and then spread it to others, because, you know, so much of this, you know, is based on ignorance that we need to combat. You know, to the point about how severe anti-Semitism is, or views of how severe it is, I will say one thing is that sometimes people dismiss, overlook, or deprioritize anti-Semitism because of the logic of anti-Semitism itself, right? One thing that makes anti-Semitism distinct in some ways from some of those other forms of bigotry is that it not only holds Jews as inferior, right, but also as incredibly diabolically powerful. Right. And that's a little bit different, right? It treats Jews both as subhuman and in some ways superhuman, right? As Dr. Lannutti was just referring to the protocols of the learned elders of Zion, which is this text, this fabrication that alleged that a few Jewish leaders were going to, you know, hatch this plan to take over the world, where anti-Semitism tells people that Jews are incredibly powerful, able to control banks, able to control, you know, the global financial system, governments, the global media, even the weather, we've heard, right? So, so sometimes people will not think anti-Semitism is real or not a big problem, because if you internalize the logic of anti-Semitism, well, then you believe Jews are more or less uniformly rich, powerful, and privileged, right? And how can such a group be oppressed? And so a lot of times people will dismiss or overlook or deprioritize the fight against anti-Semitism on the basis of that internalized anti-Semitic logic.
You know, and this also brings to mind when you think about dealing with hate for Jewish Americans and just for people in general, when they encounter hateful comments, bigotry in workplaces, in educational settings. Dr. McBride, are there some techniques that you can share with our viewers about how do you handle hate in those situations, especially in educational settings?
Well, thank you for that question. When dealing with hate in an educational setting, I take sort of the three best practices that I've used over my career leading offices of diversity is first to address the incident immediately. And that means keep, documents, videos, other information relevant to this hate incident. And I lean into my law enforcement background, so forgive me for that, that it taught me that that's critical. When you look at your many hate-based incidents, they go unreported, according to the Uniform Crime Report. Number two, best practice is to implement clear policies and initiatives. At TCU, I look to my colleagues at the Office of Institutional Equity, Sharon Gooding and Andrea McDew, who recently implemented new harassment policies for the TCU community. So that is important. But also speaking of initiatives, I want to give a shout out to ADL and their No Place for Hate. It's an initiative that unites schools, communities, and engages students and staff in active learning. So it encourages them to challenge bigotry and to also promote a climate where everyone feels appreciated and we lean into those differences. And so I had the pleasure of serving on a No Place for Hate in my previous position in Salem, in Massachusetts. And so it's a four-pronged approach, the No Place for Hate. I know that my colleagues will put that program in the chat, but you form a committee, you let the students like Benjamin be the driver of the seat for the movement. You then sign the pledge. We are a school of no place for hate. You then assess your climate with a campus climate assessment, like we've done at the medical school. And then obviously, you also communicate that to your partners in your community, not just in your school, but also your community partners in your neighborhoods. And so the next thing that is important is also in healthcare is now in medical schools, and I think this is critical, Prescott, you're beginning to see the American Medical Association encourage in medical school curriculum and graduate medical education that there be curriculum on the legacies of the Holocaust in healthcare, which explores why medical participants in the Holocaust still matter. And so that is something that we all should aspire to, whether you're at an undergraduate school or high school, you can have a 1 hour credit hour pop-up on education about the Holocaust. And so those are just three practices that I would recommend. And I forgot the third, which is be public and be purposeful about being inclusive. And so at our medical school, in every syllabi or course instruction, we have an inclusivity statement for the School of Medicine. And we basically say up front, if you're a student in our class, we are committed to the creation and maintenance of an inclusive learning environment. And so we want to make sure that whether you are faith or non-faith, you have a voice in our classes and our curriculum. So I'll stop there. I know that was a mouthful.
And I also want to let everyone know we're going to put in the comments a link that Dr. McBride had to share. It's the Walk Against Hate on Sunday. It's going to be Sunday morning, April 3rd, coming up in Dallas. So you can use that link to find out more information about the Walk Against Hate and also maybe sign up to be a part of that walk. So that's some good information. Vlad, before we leave this topic of hate, are there some techniques or advice that the ADL shares with Jewish Americans about dealing with hate in workplaces or educational settings?
Yeah, well, I would say I'd probably delineate this into sort of two columns, right? First is the interpersonal, and secondly is the systemic, right, or the institutional, because anti-Semitism functions on both of those levels, right? It's not merely something that only lives in the hearts and minds of human beings. It's also embedded in our policies, our practices, right? The structures of institutions. So, and both need to be addressed, right? On the interpersonal side, certainly, it's really important to, again, educate people, make sure that they know, that anti-Semitism is a problem, make sure that they know the facts about, the rates of targeting for hate crimes, for example, that Jewish Americans experience, which is, 4 to 6 times disproportionate to our share of the population. Jewish Americans account for somewhere around 60% of targets of anti-religious hate crimes, right? More than every other group combined. So it's important that we make sure to educate people that when we experience interpersonal anti-Semitism among colleagues or classmates or others, that we intervene, that we not let it just go on. But then we also have to address it on that systemic level. So, and that includes, that environment that Dr. McBride was just talking about, right? Making sure that there's inclusivity statements, looking at, communications to students, to the broader community, looking at policies and practices that might marginalize Jewish students at the community, right? Because we live in a Christian-centric society. So, for example, our civic, holidays are Christian holidays. We get Easter off, we get Christmas off. Well, we need to make sure that, we have accommodations for Jewish students who might need to take Yom Kippur off or make up an exam or something like that. We need to make sure that we have inclusive practices around dress code in the work environment that might marginalize Jewish folks as well, right? So we need to look at all of those things. And I would say, coming back to the idea that we need to center Jewish voices when we're talking about anti-Semitism, right? It's really important to listen. Don't assume that you know what the Jewish community needs. Go to the Jewish community and ask them what they need, right? And a great way to do that, as Ben mentioned, is those affinity groups, right? Employee resource groups in the workplace. Those should be the places that you turn to get your information about what the Jewish community really needs. And, at the same time, you shouldn't let the burden of combating anti-Semitism fall to the Jewish community, right? Anti-Semitism is not a problem of the Jewish community. It's something that is, conceived, propagated, and practiced by the non-Jewish community, right? So that's really where the problem needs to be addressed.
And I want to take a second to just talk about the power of reflection when you encounter hate or bigotry. Dr. Lannutti, you recently led a session called The Legacy of Medicine During the Holocaust and Its Contemporary Relevance. What can we learn from reflecting on the Holocaust, and how powerful is having a moment of reflection before you respond to trigger words during a conversation, especially for medical students in a clinical setting?
Well, we were supposed to be a melting pot. But each successive immigrant group came over and was demonized because the people who were here were afraid. I talked to you about the voyage of the Dam, where the St. Louis, the Nazis allowed the St. Louis to leave, go to Cuba, and then they stirred up anti-Semitism. This boat, I think it was 1938, traveled, or it's a true story. It's not a movie. It is a movie, but it's not a fantasy. And of course, they couldn't wait to approach the Florida coast. And what did they find? The Coast Guard came up and said, you can't get anywhere near the Florida coast, because Franklin Roosevelt didn't want that. The unions would have been very upset to let these highly educated, sophisticated, knowledgeable people, 1,500 of them, in, and they wound up going back to Europe and wound up in the Holocaust. So, it's funny, talking about demonization, Lisa talked about Salem, but there were the witch trials. I mean, it goes back as far as that. When the Jews and the Italian Americans, I'll speak to, that came over at the 1900s, they were demonized. The black folks didn't have a chance. They didn't come over. They were taken over and they were demonized and marginalized. So in terms of to reflect, if you react to malinformation or misinformation or micro or macro aggression, you get into the gutter with these people who do that. And I'll go back to stay calm and carry on. It's my favorite expression. The British used it during the Blitz. I have a tendency, maybe it's heritage, to come out with something right away. And you learn to count to a certain number, 10, whatever you want to get to. And don't get into the gutter with these people, and because that's exactly what they're after. And you go back to the recent election with these monosyllabic, clean the swamp, lock her up. And I said, geez, that sounds familiar. We're starting to demonize people and everybody reacts to that. I could never figure out how a culture that produced Bach and Hegel and Kant and Beethoven and Mozart could descend to the depths that the Nazis did. Interestingly enough, I don't know whether Ben knows this, but Adolf Hitler applied twice to the Vienna School of Art, and he was rejected twice. It was a bad rejection. It's a shame he didn't get in. But you know what his problem was? He couldn't draw the human form effectively, which I think is fascinating. So don't get into the gutter with them. Think before you speak. Don't join them.
And we have a question that came in from Deborah. Deborah, thank you for watching. And her question is, what is the best thing you would recommend for non-Jewish people to support Jewish folks? So Vlad, can you give us a bit of information about the best way to support Jewish people here?
Yeah, well, again, I want to reiterate that the best way to support Jewish folks is to ask the folks in your life, in your community, at your school, in your workplace, what they need, right? And, again, ERGs, I just want to stress, are a really great resource for that. That's those employee resource groups, the affinity groups that Ben mentioned. Again, first is to educate yourself, because if you don't understand anti-Semitism, if you don't know the common tropes, why they're problematic, where they came from, how they've been used to marginalize, oppress, and enact violence against the Jewish community, you're not going to be as empowered to be able to do that. So first thing I would say is to continue your own education, right? And again, you can avail yourself of some of those resources that we put into the chat. And secondly, to help educate other folks, right? Make sure to take initiative, right? Don't wait until somebody asks you. If you see something anti-Semitic, report it. If you hear somebody saying something anti-Semitic, confront them about it. Now, do so in a safe way, right? Because it's not always a safe thing to approach certain people if they might be violent or something like that. But if this is somebody that you might know personally or a classmate or something like that, certainly asking a question, what do you mean by that, right? Asking them to actually examine their own ideas and what they meant by a particular utterance can sometimes really get people to start thinking and reflecting about the implications of their words, right? So, it's important to make sure that we don't let these things just sort of go and fester, because the problem is anytime that you sort of allow these things to go unchallenged in your environment, you're sort of giving it weight, right? Human beings are social creatures, and we take our cues on what is or isn't acceptable from those around us. And so if we give people a sense that, if they tell an anti-Semitic joke or they make an anti-Semitic remark, that is unacceptable, and that they will not be, gaining any social currency as a result of saying those things. Rather, they're going to lose social currency. A lot of times, for most people, that's going to be enough, right?
Right.
So make sure to challenge those things.
And Ben, I actually want to give you the final thought on that particular question. What would you like to say to other medical students about supporting the Jewish community?
Yes, thank you for that opportunity to talk. Really, to me, kind of what Vlad has been talking about, it's to challenge those things, even when it's a small joke, like, oh, you're Jewish, Ben, you must be good with money. That's kind of funny, but also, challenge those things, similar to how if there was a Black person and there was like watermelon or all these stereotypes we think about, challenge them all the same as you would something else. Don't just let that go. And because once you do let that go, then it's a slippery slope. and then what's next? And so my final comments on that is really to, ask questions and to show up and to kind of learn about it and challenge those things when they're said.
All right. All right. Well, that will do it for today's FWMD live chat. I want to thank everyone on Facebook for watching and being a part of today's live chat. And I also want to give a very special thanks to our guests, Dr. McBride, Vlad, Dr. Lannutti, and Benjamin. Thank you all for being great panelists for this important discussion.
Thanks, Prescott.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And once again, thank you everyone for watching, and we'll see you again soon.